Just a simple prayer to our divine creator, to the governor of this planet, Christ Jesus, to our spirit and mentors, individual, and those that oversee the work here at the SSB. Allow us to be the vessel and the vehicle of tonight's message. Allow each one of our hearts to connect humbly, lovingly. And may we have ears to hear and eyes to see. We thank you for this moment, and so be it. The light. Just fixing some technical things real quick. Okay, you're good to go. Thanks, Chris. Chris, I'm going to ask you a favor. Can you pour me a little bit of water? Yeah, because I know I'm going to be coughing. Oh, times of health and conscientiousness. Guys, we've been studying this book now, or, well, are we studying it? We've been talking about and giving presentations now for quite a bit. Thank you. For quite a bit. And today's chapter is on understanding, which is really interesting given the message that we chose from Joanna about the importance of listening. Because let me ask this question, even though I kind of already preemptively gave the answer in a sense. In what way or in what fashion, how does one understand another person? How do we, if someone says to you, well, I need you to understand, if I say to Vlad, I need you to understand Samya. And then I ask Vlad, well, how do you plan to try to be more understanding or to understand Samya? You might say, listen, you would talk. Great. And Chris, if I were to ask you, how are you going to, be more understanding of your mom or others in your life? You might say something like, you would think, okay, contemplate, reflect, okay. So listening is a big part as well. Listening is a big part. But understanding in and of itself is pretty vital when we're dealing with relationships, when we're dealing with others. Because if we can't find understanding, we can't find common ground, and wars persist, whether it's wars in a relationship, in a marriage, or between, parent and child. So it's a true story, short and brief. This lawyer, he was a lawyer, a speaker, writer, and a mediator. He mediated divorce proceedings when there was like major issues. He would be called in as a mediator. So there's one particular case, this particular lawyer, he said, look, I came across this case. It was a husband and wife that were already divorced, but they were fighting over a particular item. He said, so they came into my office, and the ex-wife said to her, to me, my ex-husband has taken something very valuable and refuses to give it back. And then she proceeds to explain what it is. She said, it's a painting of my deceased mother. And she went on to explain, look, I'm an orphan. I never met my father. My mother died when I was a little girl. I was raised by my grandmother. My grandmother had painted a beautiful portrait of my mother. And that portrait was the only photo that I had of her. That's it. There was no photographs. There was nothing. This is the solid thing that I had. And a couple weeks ago, prior to them finalizing their divorce, her grandmother, who raised her, actually signed the portrait. And when they were divorcing and moving and moving out of the home, she said when she went looking for the portrait, it was gone, and only one person had access to the house besides herself. So she said, I just want it back, John, her ex-husband. And so the mediator began to try to mediate, thinking he understood probably maybe, the ex-husband might have done it for X reason or this reason. And the ex-wife turned to her ex-husband and said, John, you need to stop punishing me for being unfaithful. And the mediator was again trying to help the ex-husband and thought that maybe he had doing it for some other reasons. But it turned out the ex-husband, John, turned to his ex-wife, Sophia, and said, Sophia, let me go back real quick. John, the ex-husband, was also an orphan. He never knew his parents. He was raised by a relative that never really made an impression on him. So his wife's grandmother was like his grandmother. And he said to Sophia, she was my grandmother too. And that painting held significance to me too, not just to you. And then he began to sob, crying. And then the ex-wife began to sob, crying, because she never knew. She didn't know, never had that understanding from her now ex-husband that he had felt that alone, that he had felt like an orphan like she had, and that her grandmother, who had been a huge part of his life, their life together as a couple, had made such an impact on him. And that's the reason why he took the portrait. It wasn't to spite her. It was because he said, I not only lost you, Sophia, but I lost my grandmother. And I wanted something to hold on to. So when we talk about understanding, we often think that people do things to spite us, when in fact, it's not about spite per se. It's that all of us as human beings, we have basic needs. We talked about Abraham Maslow, great psychologist. We talked about other great theorists out there, Carl Rogers and others. And there's this understanding that we have basic human needs. Aside from like we need to eat, breathe, feel secure. Aside from that is that desire to feel accepted and loved. And that's what drives a lot of what we do. And that's why Joanna, not by chance, in this small chapter talks about how pivotal, how important it is to have understanding in our relationships, in our comings and goings when we are dealing with one another, because we don't know the need. Much like Sophia, who had been married for over a decade to this man, had no understanding, had no clue that he had felt this way. And it wasn't until, this horrific divorce and all these things that happened, that they were actually able to connect. And he was able to find forgiveness, and she was able to find forgiveness and understanding when they were opening up to listen to one another. So I'm going to skip the positive affirmations and leave it for later, because I want to get into some other thoughts that Joanna shares. Because we talked about this before, we're social beings, right? Who here doesn't like to see other people? Okay, nobody's raising their hand. So we all like to be around people, right? And I'm not talking about you guys like to go out and party, but, have tea with a friend, make a meal with a friend, see a loved one, because we are, by divine design, we are social beings. We are meant to be amongst one another. And Joanna affirms that. She says that we are instinctively gregarious and need to be with one another in healthy interaction in order to receive and provide stimuli that lead to their development. Due to numerous factors, human understanding regarding other people's limitations and problems has become scarcer, something necessary, yet rare. Much like in the story of Sophia and John, that is not uncommon across the globe, that we see one act of one person and we take it as an act of aggression, thinking that that person wants to spite us and hurt us, when in fact, we lack understanding of other people's limitations. We live in a world full of Sophias and Johns. We don't listen to one another. We don't try to understand. And Joanna tells us it becomes the ability to understand one another becomes scarcer and scarcer. and extremely rare. Imperiously eager to communicate, individuals look for relationships and yearn to disclose themselves to each other. We yearn to connect. We want to connect to another human being so desperately sometimes that you have the Johns of our life stealing a portrait, which is not the grandmother, but that's all he had. Yearning for that connection, yet the human heart dreads being exposed. What they are is their troubling treasure, and they are afraid to see it despised. For over a decade, they were married, but he was never able to be vulnerable to his wife and expose who he was because he was fearful, and so was she. And they are us. We, Joanna's telling us, we dread. Although we yearn to be close to others, at the same time, we're terrified. We're scared that people won't accept us. And acceptance is a very basic human need. Some say that Adolf Hitler, many people don't know this fact. Adolf Hitler, before he became who he was and most known for, he was a fantastic artist. I believe some of his art still exists somewhere today. He really was talented. But after attempting multiple times to get into art school, he was denied again and again. And some say because of that lack of acceptance from others, he went on this rampage and he just lost his mind and became the person that he was. Because deep within inside himself, he wanted to be accepted, but he turned and pushed that conflict out, and he created division amongst people. Because human beings, we do not gain anything from hurting others. Because it's not a basic need. What happens is that one of our basic needs are not being fulfilled, and we go in search of it, sometimes to our detriment, such as some people do steal paintings of their ex-wives' mothers. But it's to fulfill a basic need. Everything's okay, Daniel? Lecture? Okay. Their actual way of being is different from the image they portray and fear losing. This is so because they do not expect to receive understanding. I'm going to mention this. I'm not even sure what to call him. He's like a multi-millionaire, kind of became an internet presence, if you will. I won't mention his name, actually, because it's too controversial. For the sake of the conversation, someone who became really popular online, especially people of the male gender, and female as well, but more male, because he said a lot of controversial things about male and female roles and whatnot. But he's extremely popular and was followed by millions of people. And he let's just say he was really famous. But then all social platforms, I think at the end of last year, banned him. Like he's completely off all social media for different reasons. But he was interviewed and by this woman, by this journalist, and she did something that no one else, in the multiple interviews that happened post his ban, people were so curious, like, how are you doing? How are you surviving? And lots of people were asking lots of different kinds of questions and provoking a lot of his rhetoric that can be controversial. But this particular journalist, she wanted to go deeper. She wanted to understand who this man was in his heart of hearts. And she asked him something to the effect of, don't you respect women? And he said, oh, I have the greatest respect for women, which is like, to hear this particular influencer say that was a little shocking. He said, I have so much respect for women and the women in my life that I only wish to protect them So we're sharing all this because on one hand, we can see people portraying themselves as this strong, person, but in reality, they're just scared of losing the things that they love and hold dearest to them. And he was explaining to this journalist, look, the reason why I say what I say and I am so private, and I urge others to be as well, and why I urge people to have, basic family values, is to protect the goodness in us all. So we don't really know who someone is because Joanna has talked about this before. Sometimes we can portray or project an image. So it just makes us think, do we really know and understand one another? And there is a science and a psychology behind all of this. When we talked about the basic human needs, once we fulfill all of our physical needs of eating, feeling safe, things of that nature, but that need to fulfill all of one's potential and the need to receive acceptance, respect, is huge. And there was a study done, and just sharing an excerpt from that study of Marcelo Barg and Goldwitzer, 2009, that said, we are motivated to seek food, water, and sex, but our behavior is also influenced by social approval, acceptance, the need to achieve, and the motivation to take or to avoid risks, to name a few. Basic human needs, we are driven by these things. And then there's a neuroscience behind it all, and something called social cognition. Has anyone ever heard of that before? Social cognition? Don't worry if you haven't. It basically is a subtopic of social psychology that focuses on how people process, store, and apply information about other people in social situations. It focuses on the role that cognitive processes play in our social interactions. Sorry about that. The way we think about others plays a major role in how we think, feel, and interact with the world around us. And another study that came out in 2002 by Gallagher and McCabe, let me explain this particular research that came out on the brain. That they found, they did this study where they studied like 200 individuals, and 100 of them were 100. All of them, actually, I should say, all of them had access to this computer game, but only 100 were told they were playing directly with the computer itself, and the other 100 were told they were actually playing with another human being that was somewhere else. Well, the interesting thing was that in actuality, everybody was playing with a computer. But you're not like the computer inside the computer. You guys find what I'm saying? I'm not a big computer gamer person, so I don't know the terminology. So 100 of them thought that they were playing with another human being, although they couldn't see. They just saw, the computer screen. And the other 100 thought they were just playing with the computer. When in fact, they were all playing with the computer. So what they found in their brain was that even though, let me read this. It was only when participants believed they were playing against another person that the particular set of brain regions subserving social cognition became engaged. So when the people who believed they were playing just a computer, this social part of their brain was not activated. But the people who believed, even though they weren't playing with another person, this part of their brain became activated. Saying all this to say is that there's an actual part in our brain that has to do with how we socialize. When we socialize, it gets activated. Thank you, Dano. It is hot in here. So getting into more of what Joanna has to say about understanding. She says that understanding is the ability that best contributes to success in human relationships because it validates the other person's positive and negative qualities. When John and Sophia stood face to face, talking about something that was so precious to each one of them, was such a healing moment. Why? Because of this. because they were able to understand. Sophia was able to understand that although she didn't agree that her ex-husband stole the portrait, what she did in turn was to go and look for portraits and photographs of her grandmother to share with her ex-husband. So he had something he could physically hold on to, that he could look at and see. So in that understanding that she was giving to him, she could acknowledge, like, okay, you know, that wasn't great what you did, but I understand why you did it. You did it because you wanted, because my grandmother was your grandmother. And likewise, John extending understanding to her for various different reasons. It reflects great spiritual development, through which it offers support and guidance to the one who seeks it in difficult situations. There probably hasn't been a moment in any of our lives where we haven't hoped or wished that someone would be more understanding of us. But it shows this great spiritual development when we are able to offer this understanding. She goes on to say, understanding distends solidarity, providing the necessary therapeutic resources according to the needs of the moment. Without agreeing with everything that is said or rejecting it outright, understanding benefits the listener, who is then truly heard. One of the reasons why many people might have a problem, why we might have a problem with finding understanding in others who have done wrong, specifically when we look at quote unquote criminals, because we might think, well, if I'm trying to find understanding in this criminal, then that means I am saying that it was okay what that person did, and it's not. Finding understanding is not agreeing, as Joanna says, with what has been done, nor rejecting it, but just understanding and listening to that person. That's an important key factor, because there are a lot of relationships that remain broken because I think, well, if I try to understand, this person who harmed me, then I'm acquiescing, then I'm saying that what they did is wiped clean and forgiven, and it was okay what they did. It's not okaying what they did. Finding understanding is finding peace. Joanna goes on to say, the world is full of deaf people talking with one another, of mute socialization being expressed in intense, silent interactions. We speak to one another sometimes. Nothing ever really gets done. As she says, there's much talk about nothing, resolving a broad spectrum of problems that remain. People talk and they think, well, we have to communicate. Communication's important. Well, I said what I had to say and I let them speak. But you're deaf, and so is the other person. Because are you listening? So she reminds us, when people approach you to talk, try to listen and register their words. Perhaps you cannot offer the best advice or do what is expected of you, but quite often they only want a listening ear. Once we had asked Divaldo, and I think many people over the years have, how do you manage so many people coming up to you and pouring out their lives to you and their problems? And he said something, he said, majority of the time when people come and talk to me, majority of the time, I don't know if that's 80%, 75%, but majority, they just need to be heard and listened to. And once that happens, majority of the time they're able to work through their own emotions, having listened to their own self speak. And most of what they want is just to feel validated and heard, that someone understands them. Daniel, I'm hearing feedback. I was speaking with one of my sisters recently. I have two sisters. And we joke because one is really good with dealing with emotions. And if you cry in front of her, she's very supportive. But this other sister, if you cry in front of her, she just starts laughing, gets very uncomfortable, and she'll leave. So I was talking to the sister who doesn't know how to handle other people crying to her. And she said, well, I just don't know what to say. It's weird. Okay, you're crying. Ugh. I said, well, what are you scared of? And she said to me, well, I'm afraid I won't say the right thing, or I can't help you. I said, most people just want to be listened to. Just sit there and listen what they have to say. And she said she hadn't thought about that before, because sometimes that's the best we can do, is just offer a listening ear. And you might have heard this famous phrase, most people do not listen with intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. Oh, how many times I have seen this, experienced it. We all have, when we're in a vocal battle back and forth with someone, and you're speaking, the other person interrupts you. And I do believe, because I think everyone in this room is somehow of Brazilian origin. It's a cultural thing, right? Where we tend to talk over one another, right? It's amazing that, it's cultural. What's that? Try to watch Dr. Phil. I say this in jest. Both my parents, or my late father and my mother, Brazilian. But we cannot hear the other person if we're constantly thinking in our head how we're going to reply. But that's how most of us, regardless of culture, most of us, we're like that, because it's a defense mechanism. You're hearing your spouse or your partner or your neighbor say, well, I saw you put the trash can, and because some neighbors are kind of crazy, I saw you put that trash can on the left side of the curb when it's supposed to be on the right. And as they're saying that, you're like, yeah, well, I saw you your dog pooped last week and you didn't let it, and they start going, and you go into this battle, but neither one is listening to the other. We're not trying to be understanding of one another. Had a neighbor like that who was super particular about everything. I mean, I was a child, so didn't really affect us, the kids and me and my siblings, but it seemed to really affect my parents, more of an annoyance. Okay, they have this one neighbor that's always, until one day I remember my dad was outside talking to the neighbor, and he came back inside, and he had this somber look on his face. And my dad was always lively. He always liked to talk and had a story. So for my dad to come into the house and he looked down, I was like, what, something's up. I was like, Dad, what happened? Were you talking to Carl? He's like, yeah, I was. I'm like, did he say something really horrible to you? That's why you look sad? And he said, kind of. I was like, ooh, dish. What is it? Gossip. I'm 10. And he said, no. He said, it's not the kind of gossip or anything that anyone would ever want to hear. And he said that he told me that he had been diagnosed with an advanced cancer. And he's been battling it for years. He's never told anyone. He's never shared that with anyone. He doesn't have family. His parents are deceased. He has no siblings. He has a wife who's always sick, and he helps take care of her. And he just always seemed like a really disgruntled neighbor, constantly. I mean, in my memory as a child. And my father said, I didn't know. And now I can it makes sense now why he said to me, I know that I'm a real picky old man and I always want things my way. But he said, I always felt like I didn't have control over my life. The only thing I could control were these little things. And he said, Eddie, that's why I'm a pain in the butt. So we begin to understand people more and listen to them. We change. We change for the better. Because after that day, prior to that day, there always was this animosity. It always was like just palpable in the air. But after that, all that was just gone. And in its place was this quiet understanding that here was this man that felt alone. We always thought he was well-to-do. He always seemed like he had everything and nice car, nice things. Here he was, just a person who felt alone, and he just wanted understanding. And from that day forward, my father sure kept the trash can on the left side, not hitting on the right anymore, or whatever it was. You might think it's minor and small, but it helped the neighbor to feel better. It's a small charity. And Joanna, she shares with us. She gives us insights into how we can be more understanding. And she says, give them your attention and you will encourage them, making them feel worthy of interest. And this is what I saw my father do. Here was a neighbor who did not feel worthy, who felt worthless, not listened to or understand to, had been suffering for many, many years. Suddenly, this old man, who was old and dying, unbeknownst to us, changed. And we were changed because of that. Because of that one moment, my father said, he just had this thought come to his mind. Because Carl was always working in his garage, always tinkering with things. He had like a whole little like workshop. He would like make things. So one day, my dad just, walked in there because our house was connected. And he starts talking to him. And because of that one moment, everything changed. If they decide to trust you and open up, respect their problems and help them if you can. And that's what he did. My father didn't turn to him and say, oh, well, there's so many people with cancer. There's so many people that are orphaned and feel alone in the world. But he respected his issue and he helped where he could. And the only way that he could help was to keep the trash can on the left side of the pavement. On your part, overcome the fear of opening up. Of course, you cannot neglect prudence or balance, but it is healthy to dialogue and unveil the panels hidden by the ego or masked to reflect unrealistic images. As a frail human being, living honestly with others will contribute effectively to your inner harmony. Living honestly, living authentically, you will be happier people. And through that one example that was probably to my father seemingly so small and insignificant. By the way, not that he was perfect. So far from it. And trust me, we let him know it. But it was that small example that helps put things into context when we read things like this. Living honestly, living authentically, living who we are brings us inner harmony. So be empathetic and patient, a fraternal therapist. Do not create stereotypes or label people with images that are but a passing phase. We are all undergoing continuous transformations. And we are not always today what we seem to have been yesterday. New experiences and lessons have been added to the lives of others, as is the case with you. And this is a continual problem that we partake in, that others partake in, is that we take a mental snapshot of one another. I'll take a snapshot. Let's pretend Samia is my sister. Samia and I grew up together, and I took a snapshot of her when she was a teenager and she was super messy or something. Although anyone that knows Samia, she's not messy. But let's just say, and I snapped that photograph of my sister, and her whole life, no matter how, as we both are getting older, and I continuously treat her as if she's still that Samia when she was 14. We do this to one another. Siblings do it often. We don't mean to. But we do that. We do that as parents. I look at my 21-year-old, and I just recently, I was decluttering our walk-in closet, and I unearthed one of my favorite photographs I took of me and my daughter when she was very little. She must have been about 4. And it was a photograph that I always had on my bureau when I, was a single parent many moons ago. It was very near and dear to my heart. I don't know how it got stuck somewhere else, but in any event, I unearthed it. But when I look at my daughter, I always am trying to remind myself, she's not that 4-year-old in that photograph. But it's so easy to, look at her and think, oh, my little angel. She's in another room over there. She's not an angel. None of us are. If we were, we wouldn't be here. But we have to learn to take new photographs. Or perhaps stop taking photographs at all, mental photographs altogether, and just allow people to be who they are. Dr. Wayne Dyer, the late Dr. Wayne Dyer, he said, here's a quote, love people or love others for who they are and not what you want them to be. Love others for who they are and not for what you want them to be. That is understanding. When we can meet someone where they are and not where we want them to be, and hold that person to that standard. Joanna says, it is the inexorable imperative of progress and action. New experiences and lessons that we are always changing and growing. So let us afford that to others. Let us allow others to be something different from what we hold in our minds of them. Much like Sophia looking at her ex-husband, always viewing him as a vindictive person, in that moment, she allowed him to be something other than what she always thought he was. She saw him as another human being who wanted love, who wanted acceptance, who wanted a family, and that through her own choices took some of that away in his eyes. So it was through that understanding that she could find that forgiveness. So friends, some last thoughts from this chapter from Joanna. She says, in understanding your neighbors and relating with them, you will be kinder to yourself. Love thy neighbor. Love thy neighbor. We're told, love thy neighbor. But there's so much more power to that, as Joanna points out to us here. Because when we love, we understand. When we can relate with them, in turn, we are kinder to ourselves. Realizing their weaknesses, you will be more attentive to your own limits and will seek to grow, loving others and yourself more. Exactly what happened with my father and our neighbor. As he found understanding through the neighbor who we just thought was really, grumpy old man and mean, when he sought to understand him, he began to become more attentive to my father became more attentive of his own limitations. That's why you might say, oh, well, your dad shouldn't have had to move and be so particular about where he puts the trash can or the trash receptacle. Something small made someone else happy. It's finding understanding. And I'll give you a more personal, or perhaps personal or more relatable example of this. And we can find this in relationships. So when I first got married, allegedly, I was told, I would leave these alleged towels on our bed, wet towels after showering, although I have no recollection of this. But let's just say, for the sake of the story, I used to leave wet towels on the bed after showering. And this really perturbed my husband to no end. But I continued to do this for I don't even know how many years, until one day I thought to myself, I could just hang up my towel when I'm done, and probably that would make my spouse happy. So I began to do that. Wow, it was like an epiphany. But we do that a lot with one another. We have these proverbial towels that we can make a small modification, which ends up being beneficial to ourselves because things are more neat. And there was an example, this lawyer that I gave the example of, the mediator, he told a story about him and his wife. And he said, my wife is very particular about how we put the dishes away. She likes them cleaned and put away in a specific way. And he said, I know that she likes clean dishes, so I always make it a point after dinner, I'll wash dishes so you can go sit down. But he says, I always, for years, see her out of the corner of my eye, spying on how I'm cleaning everything. And, because he said, I just would want to get it done. And every time for years and years and years, she'd go back behind me and fix it the way she wanted. And then he said, one day I thought to myself, Larry, I should just do it the way that she wants me to do it, because she doesn't ask for much. Just this little thing. It's small, because to her, that meant that small little detail to her communicated that I cared and that I loved her. Doesn't matter the fact that he said, that's because I didn't do it, didn't mean that I didn't love her. I love my wife. But to her, he understood that was the language she spoke. He said, after that, my wife was so grateful that I did that one little thing. It was better than roses on Valentine's Day or Tiffany's box on a birthday. It's understanding and trying to relate to one another, understanding our weaknesses, being more attentive of our own limits. We will seek to grow and loving others and ourselves more. And as we are reminded in the gospel, love, O Spiritists, love one another. This is the first teaching. Educate yourselves. This is the second. So let us educate ourselves in being more understanding of one another. We might not understand why, like Larry might not understand exactly why putting away the dishes, facing the right, but the design all matching up matters so much to his wife, even though she's explaining to him. Doesn't matter. He said, she said in the end, it makes her feel appreciated, it makes her feel loved that he can do this small little thing. So he said after that, he began to educate himself on how to be a better person. Small little things and the relationships with everyone in his life. So love one another is our mandate, and educating ourselves is the second. And that, dear friends, concludes our message for this evening. Take a little small break. Thanks so much, Chris, for the water. And what's that, Daniel? Questions, comments? If you don't, that's okay. Did this resonate at all? So Chris is asking, I'm going to repeat it for the microphone. Chris is asking, what if someone doesn't understand us?
Or no, we're trying to get them to understand us. But in turn, they misunderstand us when we're trying to explain ourselves to them. And then things get worse.
So Chris is asking, what if we're trying to get someone else to understand us, but they just don't understand us? They misunderstand us. So it's quite common, right? A lot of us, we can experience that. We want to be understood. The point is that we cannot control anybody else but ourselves. It's a hard pill to swallow, because trust me, we all want that too. We want to be understood. We want to be heard. But the reality is that we cannot control what others do, think, feel. At best, we can be like my father was to the neighbor. We should be the ones, because we are responsible only for ourselves. Let us be the ones to just find understanding of the other person. That might look like, well, I'm going to have to be the bigger person here and understand that they don't understand me. But hopefully at some point, with lots of prayer, maybe they'll come to understand. Or maybe doing some educating yourself a little bit and trying to find more creative ways to explain how you feel. There are lots of listening techniques, is what often happens between individuals, is that we're not listening to one another. We listen to reply. We listen enough so we can have a rebuttal. We don't listen to understand. So when you're listening, when you're hearing somebody talk, and if in your mind you're already thinking of a response, you're not listening. That's a good point, though. We all do it. We've all had that same experience. It's very common in relationships and marriages. Someone might say, well, that person doesn't understand me. Why should I understand them? Well, that person doesn't do this for me. Why should I do it for them? Because we are only responsible for ourselves. I always think back to that story from, 2,000 years ago. Do we have that here still? I don't know where it is. Of Publius Lentulus and his wife, Lydia, right? Livia, okay. It's been a while since I've read the book, sorry. Well, if you read the story, this is just a quick highlight overview. Publius Lentulus absolutely loved and adored his wife, but some things happened and made him believe that she was having an affair. So he basically stayed married to her, obviously, because at that time nobody got divorced. But he treated it, he basically didn't speak to her. And that was extremely painful. And in the book, they talk about it. It's a Spiritist book. Wow, it's been a long time since I've read it. Now I'm forgetting. Is it Chico Daniel? Chico Xavier? Psychographed the book. It's really been a really long time. Yeah, there you go. It's over there, right? So they go, in the manual goes into enough detail where we can get the feeling of how Livia felt, how hard it must have been for her, because she wasn't unfaithful to her husband. That had just been some people that were creating intrigue and all kinds of problems for her marriage. She loved and adored her husband. So it was even more difficult for her to have to deal with someone whom she loved, treating her that way, knowing that it was uncalled for and unjust. But what did she do? Who remembers from the book what she did? That's okay. I barely remembered most of it right now. So what she did is what most people don't want to do. Is she remained loving. She still loved him. She remained sweet and kind. And in the end, part of the end, I'm going to ruin the story for you guys. Sorry if you haven't read it. He regretted tremendously the way he treated her. Because in the end, the truth came out. And his love tripled for her. But her spiritual evolution, she did a huge jump. And they say that sometimes Manuel sees Livia on a star far away, and he writes songs for her, saying how much he still loves her. So it's an example for us that despite what others might do, be understanding anyway. If someone doesn't love you the way that you should be loved, love anyway. We shouldn't determine our actions by the actions of others. Then we give other people power that they shouldn't have. We have power over our own happiness. Bottom line. Yes.
I have a neighbor.
Oh, stop sharing? Okay. Go ahead. Okay. Okay. So should I make this big or no? Okay. Oh, weird. Go ahead, Antonia. It's still online, yes. Okay. Want to wait? Okay. Well, they can't hear you, but you're not mic'd. I am. We could share later.
We have a neighbor, and she kind of doesn't like people around the neighborhood. Everything that is talk bad about the neighbor. We don't talk much with them because we didn't talk to them, so we don't hear much. But she talks bad about the neighbor that moved across the street. And I thought they were friends because I know her husband at least, knew the people, a young couple.
Mm-hmm.
And turned out that we got to know this young couple, and they are the best neighbors on the street.
Mm-hmm.
They help everybody on the street, but we got to know them better than she did. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not understand why she would say something bad about, or complain, or it's just someone that likes to complain.
Could be.
You know,
So for those of you who are
always find something negative stuff
yeah.
about someone instead of observing and try to get to know the person really well.
Yeah. Yeah. So just for our audiences that are listening, we had someone just share a personal story about a neighbor and someone bad-mouthing, let's say, neighbor A. But then the person who's sharing the story decided to get to know neighbor A and not listen to neighbor B, who was bad-mouthing neighbor A. And it turned out that as they got to know this neighbor A, they were able to actually discover that they were actually really wonderful. And the rest of the neighborhood thought that way. And not really sure why neighbor B was saying bad things, but that's a great example because, sometimes people, as they say, misery loves company. So sometimes people say bad things, or sometimes people can, again, take one snapshot. They have one small misunderstanding, and they'll think that that's the way that it is, that that's who that person is. They're not good people. And it's not true.
I think the word
Assuming,
yeah,
when we make assumptions about others.
pluralize most of
Yeah.
And putting labels.
And putting labels, yeah. Stereotypes and labels, yeah, they're the worst. They're the worst. Daniel, we don't have any questions online, do we? Okay. So Yasko says, hi, dear Kirsten. I wonder whether the difficult in listening or not allowing the other to finish their thoughts and arguments, if it is a pattern, may be fair indicator that we may not be okay. We are frustrated. How do we apply the famous, quote, know thyself to us to change this pattern? You can leave that question up there, Daniel. Well, only you know, only an individual, only I know if I am not okay. In myself. It could be an indicator. It could just be a pattern of culture, that it's not an indicator at all of someone not being okay. It's just, what people do in that particular culture. But if you're seeking to be a better listener and to change that behavior, to know thyself, well, the very fact that this person, or if you or someone is acknowledging, okay, I'm realizing that I have this tendency to talk over people and I don't want to be that way anymore. It's being conscious of that and having to make a conscious effort not to do that. I will say, like any other habit that you try to change, it's very difficult. Very difficult. You're going to fall back into old patterns very easily because it's what you've known. But if you stay persistent, you can change, especially if it has meaning for you. If you want more meaningful relationships in your life, you want to hear the other person. And really, it's a form of charity. We talk about charity here at any Spiritist Center. We talk about how important charity is. This is the easiest charity we can give to one another, is allowing others to speak and to be able to listen to them. But thank you, Yasko, for your question. Okay. A comment from Paula: giving our full attention is challenging as we are distractible and their words trigger questions or similar experiences. Listening from our hearts trumps listening from our brains. Yeah. Great point, Paula. If the speaker uses more I messages, such as I feel when such and such happens, we might grow more emotionally honest, and or the listener uses active listening. That's a great point. Thank you, Paula. Thank you for teaching social and emotional intelligence in your talk. Thank you, Paula. Hey, Rosara, and everyone else that's listening. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. So this leads us to our second half of our meeting, which is the passes. So can I close here, Daniel? Do I close here? Okay. All right, dear friends online, thank you so much for watching and listening. I feel like it's been a while since we've had to sign off in this way, which is odd. But if you haven't, for those of you who are watching online, if you have any other additional questions, concerns, comments, you always can write into us at the SSB. You can go to our website. And now we're going to move to the passes portion of this evening. So we bid all of you a good evening that are watching virtually. Good night.